Well, first, thank you for inviting me here. It's never needed an excuse to come to beautiful Sydney, but once you have one, it's really, really great. So thank you, Cuscal, for inviting me. But more importantly, thank you for inviting Feedzai. And I always like to say, we like to work with like-minded organizations, particularly those that are pushing boundaries in what they do. And I assume that most of you don't know about Feedzai. We're a fintech. I'm based in San Mateo in California. And what we do is essentially, we set ourselves to essentially protect commerce, make sure that you, me, as consumers, whenever we transact something, whenever we buy something, whenever we interact with a financial services organization, that we are protected. But we take it and you heard in the panel before, and I'll talk to that, with a special care of don't get in the way. So don't get in the way of consumers. Don't cause unnecessary friction, like second factor authentication, or like asking yet for one more message, one more confirmation. Enable commerce, enable transactions to happen. To give you a little bit of stats about us, $5 billion every single day are scored by us. This is just on the transaction part. On the account origination or account movement part, there's about 200 million people that every month go through our systems, and this ranging from places like US, Europe, India, here in Australia. And that every single day, roughly speaking, 30 million transactions are protected by us across the globe. And it's interesting because the first thing I like to talk about is, and there was enough conversation on this, but open banking is something that is not about technology. It's not about what the regulators say. It's not about any of that, in my view. It's about what matters for me as a consumer, for people. It's about why do I mean, most people, if you go out there on the street, they don't know what open banking is. We in this room know really well, but most people don't. But this actually impacts their life. And impacts their lives because they want to go to a challenger bank and still take their good citizen information and use that to open an account or to get a good service or a good offer from that organization. This is why we're doing this. And it's always impressive to me to see, as an innovator or something that's trying to build a company, to see the challenges, something as simple as that. It's a simple concept. Why wouldn't we all want to give that to people? And then you see the resistance. You see the organizations out there that take too long to implement this, that take forever to adopt something that seems, the right thing for a consumer. And this is when we started our journey with Cuscal about a year and a half ago. It was really interesting because it was actually known to me from a reputation, but fairly from afar, how innovative payments or the way fintech or the way financial services were looked here in Australia with things like the NPP. I mean, I hope you guys realize that's state of the art compared to what's out there, compared to what's done in London, compared to what's done in the US. Yes, there are some players here and there that do that, but as a whole, as an organization, or as a country, as a system, I think what I see here, it's pretty advanced. And I'll name a few reasons why we at Feedzai want to be associated with that. And then if you build on that, things like you have here, like the CDR, it's really important to keep that and to have a balance between me as a consumer and my data rights, and how do I balance that in getting the best service out there. From what we've seen and from the coverage we have out there, working with some of the largest financial institutions, and I didn't mention that, but we're backed for the likes of Capital One in the US, they're one of our investors, Citibank as well. What I see here, it actually enables me as a company to learn and to export that, to take that kind of best practices to other places. And let me give you some examples of what we do concretely with Cuscal. So we've been live now for a few time. What we already have there is 49% of improvements on the detection rates. This is important. This is, we're stopping more bad actors. But actually more important than that is the 13% reduction on false positives. That in risk management is basically the amount of good people that, you're not annoying. I use the expression annoying because we've all had our credit cards declined. And there's nothing worse than you're at the restaurant or you're at the place or you're traveling internationally and your credit card gets declined. So that I actually value more, the removal of consumer friction and consumer satisfaction than the fraud detection itself. So when you get to improve both, that I think is the best of both worlds. We've done that. And what I wanted to talk to you, and then they will speak in the panel later on, and we're a technical organization, so we are going to bother you with a live demo of our technology. And it's going to be pretty technical, but I think when we talk about machine learning, when we talk about artificial intelligence, it's really important to demystify some of the things there and to actually show it. This is what it means. I believe that too many of us have heard about it, but have actually not seen it. So we're actually going to show it today. And, when we're leading innovation, and as I say, I'm learning here. I'm learning with our partnership at Cuscal. What are we learning? And we're learning a number of things. And we're embedding, and you'll see some of the acronyms are even similar. Some of the things we have implemented, something we called OpenML. Actually, the principle is fairly the same as open banking, which is basically an open machine learning approach to, instead of, like traditionally has been the case, I'm a vendor, I come here and say, here's my machine learning model to detect fraud or to manage risk in account opening or transaction scoring in Australia. I can do that, but I can also, and I think it's a lot more interesting, work with the organizations here, Cuscal or some of their clients, and say, do you have people that know your region, know your segment, actually better than I do? And OpenML is essentially a framework we have that allows data scientists or people that know data, analysts, to come together and put their own versions of their models to work specific to their own use cases, as opposed to what historically was the case. Here's the black box, and trust me with the score that comes out in the end. I think going forward, you need to have this flexibility. This also allows to take care of data privacy concerns, because you might have a model for a segment or for a particular consumer or particular client that doesn't share data with another model for another client. And it's really important to have those type of mechanisms. So, and you'll see this in the demo. Another one that I think is really important, and here, as one of the first countries to actually put, intraday settlements, faster settlements, fraudsters or risk happens at the speed of the settlement, at the speed of light. So you cannot have what was called a static model that you put in production or you deploy, and then you wait for a year to see if it works or not, or you wait for 6 months. The way commerce is done, and again, think about the consumers. People change their behaviors. People today, they buy online, then they buy something on a physical store, then they buy something here, then they buy something in London, online, all at the same time. It's really important to have what we call AutoML. It's basically the ability for the machine learning algorithms with supervision, with human supervision and taking into account regulatory frameworks and compliance and auditing and all that stuff, to understand and to pick up new signals that might be indicators of behaviors that might be wrong type of behaviors, understanding what's going on out there. So AutoML is essentially a new initiative within the whole machine learning world that enables, with limited human interaction, just supervision, pick up new signals that might be very faint, it might be very small, but that might be leading indicators of bad behavior. So those are the things we will be showing you today. So I think it's really important to wrap, and this is the message, the short message I wanted to deliver you, is here in Australia, we see probably the world's leading payment ecosystem in terms of the things that you are putting in place from a regulatory standpoint, from a driving standpoint. We like to call ourselves Australians now, although we're not from here. I have an office here. We have put people here, and I think it's really important to talk about that because innovation is happening here. So, and with Cuscal, we have a really good partner that enables us to be at the forefront of that. That helps the ecosystem being better, and it helps us as a company to build our product. And I think that's what they're going to speak about in the panel. And then we would be thrilled to show you a demo about that after the panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nuno. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, I'd like to welcome to the stage the panel for our next segment on AI, machine learning, and fraud. We have Kieran up here again, Leila Fourie from OzPayNet, Nigel Butler from Valocity, and Richard Harris from Feedzai. Just take a seat. I think we got an extra chair. I'm going to stand up. Thank you. Okay, and just a reminder, please send the messages through on the platform. I think it worked really well for our last panel discussion, so always keen to hear your thoughts. Kieran, we'll start with you. We talked a lot about, obviously, open banking in our last segment. So what are some of the shifts that you can see in the retail banking industry when it comes to modern day customers? You know, what exactly do they want, in your opinion, with regards to financial matters and payments?
So I mean, we've heard today and yesterday the layering of data and being able to analyse that, look at it, pick patterns and trends. And I think Bianca's example, she was at the supermarket and all this was happening with the payments. So one of the challenges we've got and our clients have is just how do you put that sort of layer together of saying, I know you, I know what you're doing, I can see the data. The data flow is there today. And in fact, you know, one of the reasons for choosing Feedzai is we think we can put the algorithm on top of that. So then you take digital ID, you take the challenges we've got today and you throw open banking on top. Most consumers will just want to say, you know me, you trust me, you know what I'm doing, please sort of create an ecosystem which counts. I don't want to pay for that, I just want convenience and utility. And so I think it's the consumer's been asking for it for a while. What we need to do as an industry is put those data sets together and get them working. And you heard Danny talk about algorithms, etc. We can do it. So we're at the sort of forefront of that. And but the challenge is how do you bring all that together? So without it costing a fortune, without trying to overdo. Again, the consumer doesn't want to pay for it. But we released fraud stats. Leila might talk about card not present. So you see fraud on home loans, you see fraud on card not present, you see fraud in NPP, and actually it's the same fraudsters all the time. They just keep moving from channel to channel. So I think as an industry, what we've got to do is look at open banking as that disruptive opportunity and start sharing those data sets, so that if Richard's bad in one space, he's bad everywhere else, and everybody gets onto that pretty quickly.
Thank you, Kieran. Leila, what are some of the key trends OzPayNet is seeing in the payment space?
I think if just building on what Kieran's just said, there are probably three key trends that we're seeing affecting payments. The first relates to the move to mobile. The second is the tech network or platform economy. And the third is open banking, data, and that leading to AI. Insofar as the app economy goes and the mobile phone penetration and move towards payments on the mobile phone, what we're seeing is a dramatic increase in the last year or so in the social media space. There's an enormous growth coming out of China, and that's affecting Southeast Asia and moving down to our country. WhatsApp, in their first beta pilot that they put out, had more than 1 million customers. And so you're now seeing all of the social media that any of your children or even you might be using have the ability to pay, whether it's WhatsApp, Instagram, etc. Insofar as the platform economy goes, I think that the power construct is changing, and what we expected to come out of the platform economy is expanding and growing in a way that we perhaps hadn't anticipated before. Let's just take Uber as an example. Uber are now the biggest acquirer of business accounts in the US because 30% of Uber drivers that sign up to go and work for Uber don't have business accounts. And so Uber are facilitating those business accounts. Uber are now moving into car finance. And so the platform and tech economy is shifting the power construct, and it's changing the interplay between non-traditional and traditional players. And then on the last point, which is really open data and the AI economy, I think what we're seeing is a very profound shift to an AI capability that's creeping up in the background, and it's affecting in a positive way a lot of the fraud and artificial intelligence around security, which is great, and it's also affecting our convenience and the seamless way in which people are starting to pay, and we're starting to absorb this in a way that perhaps we had not anticipated a year ago, and Australia is very much at the forefront in that space.
You talked about AI there. Can you talk a little bit more about how AI or other emerging technologies like blockchain are being used by AusPayNet's members? And are you seeing much partnership with members and fintech companies now to go about, driving innovation?
I think we're seeing a lot of partnerships evolving across the entire member base and across financial services. In fact, the World Economic Forum recently has argued that the second highest growth category in the development of APIs is in payments and financial services. And so if you look across the market, there are great examples of really exciting solutions. Let's take blockchain. CBA recently announced this initiative where they shifted 17 tons of almonds from Victoria to Germany, and that involved 5 different partners. Both NAB and Westpac are moving into natural language processing, and they've just recently announced that they're going to be using Siri and voice authenticated instructions, which are really read rather than write access. So you won't yet be able to transact on your account when you talk to Alexa or Google, but you certainly will be able to check up your accounts, and that we're very fast in this country moving to that. So and I think voice is going to be a profound driver of the way we pay. ANZ is working with UTS, and they're doing some really interesting things around machine learning. And of course, Cuscal is doing a lot of really exciting work and is at the forefront, particularly on the fraud space. We're also seeing multiple digital banks moving into the space, and they're building relationships in a way that perhaps we hadn't anticipated before, and that will restructure the industry. And I think Cuscal again is at the forefront of that with their recent announcement on the digital bank.
There's some very interesting examples there. So Nigel, might get your thoughts. If you could just, first of all, tell us a bit more about Valocity and how the technology behind your platform can help a challenger brand, such as yourself, compete with the established players out there.
Yeah, okay. For those people who don't know, we don't do air miles. So Valocity is a property information company. And the piece of information that most people want to know about a property is its value. So we build models and solutions to estimate a property's value, or we facilitate valuers actually visiting properties all over Australia. So we have the capability to facilitate that. And I guess for us, we built the technology only about 3 years ago, so we had the foresight to make sure it is modular, it is API driven. So we know that there's so many friction points in anybody going to get a mortgage. It's still a very painful experience, and everybody says, oh, we're going to do end-to-end experience. And we don't believe that any one player will be able to deliver this perfect end-to-end experience, but by being able to connect easily to those, we'll be able to do our part in that journey. So just making a whole seamless experience just from our piece.
Interesting. And what about some of the opportunities and challenges associated with this, increased availability of data that you're finding on your platform? What do you believe companies need to do to mitigate risks around this?
Yeah, so obviously, anyone who holds data now is fully aware of the importance of security and data protection. But I think one of the things that's really interesting for us is just the ownership and control of the data and making sure that's clear and transparent. So for example, if you want to get a refinance on your home, you'll go to a bank and they will arrange perhaps for a valuer to come round to your property. And so the valuer will come into your house, look around, take lots of measurements, etc. And the valuer will believe that they own that information, and then they'll pass that information through a provider, a service provider like ourselves, and we'll say, well, we own part of that. And then that will go to the bank, and then the bank will say, well, we paid for it, so we own that. So all of these people believe they own it, and the person who doesn't is the consumer. And we don't think that's actually sustainable. We think that, if the consumer's part of that journey, they're going to have ownership rights. So a key part for us is making sure every bit of information that we have, not only do we protect it, but we understand whose is it, and what are the rights of use. Now, the opportunities of that is that obviously if some people want only certain people to see or share the data. So, for example, one bank might say, well, we're happy for you to hold that information, but you can't share it with this bank. We can facilitate that, so we can enable sharing in a transparent way without actually compromising what other people want it to be used for.
Thank you. And Richard, welcome. A very interesting presentation by Nuno earlier. Can you just give us an example of how specifically Feedzai works and what sort of frauds and risks are you seeing in this space and hearing from your customers?
Sure. So you probably don't have 2 hours for me to explain exactly how it works. So I'll keep it simple. So think about it like this. It's companies like, a lot of us are referencing the Silicon Valley companies, we're referencing Google or Netflix or Amazon or Apple. What those companies have built is the ability to ingest vast quantities of data and deal with it at very, very high speed. What Feedzai has basically done is create a product that is able to do that. And Nuno's background from the European Space Agency and that kind of scale of software is what gave us that advantage on day one with the founders. And then be able to sell that and provide that to the partners that we work with. So to be able to take that kind of vast technology scale that you can get with working with those Silicon Valley companies, but bring that at an affordable level and a packaged level to companies around the world who want to be able to use that. And why is that important? Well, really, what are we trying to do? Well, you're going to create an individual relationship with the customer at a totally granular level. And going back to the presentation that I saw at the very beginning yesterday, what are companies buying here? They're not buying artificial intelligence or machine learning. They're buying that granular single view of the customer. They're not buying the drill, they're buying the hole. What they want to be able to do is to be able to have an individual relationship with their customer base and know exactly how that customer is behaving. Not what they did yesterday or what they did last week. What are they doing right now? And back to Bianca's example, all of those transactions happening online, offline, in real time through Apple Pay, through app, all of those pieces of data streaming through one point and making a single decision and conscious decisions about, is this risky or not risky? So that's what Feedzai essentially does, is bring all of those data streams together. And they don't even have to be payment data. They can be customer service data, they can be login data. All of that data is relevant to the context of how the consumer's behaving.
Interesting. And what other emerging technologies do you think are going to come into this space to help make payments online safer?
I would say it's not just about online, because as Kieran pointed out earlier, if you squeeze the balloon in one place, it gets bigger in another place. So the fraudsters aren't going to go away and get a proper job.
Okay.
So it's about, I wish they would, but
They're probably meeting next door.
yeah, exactly. They're probably
Listening in.
To give an example, I mean, we're seeing with some of our customer base, we're seeing very detailed data sets put together by criminal organizations with tens or hundreds of thousands of individual identities, individual card numbers, individual addresses, shipping addresses. They're putting together those data sets. In the past 10, 15 years ago, when I was at companies like Visa, we'd see the same card getting used 30 times in a row. And I'd ring the airline and say, can you stop this card? And they go, yeah, we'll do it next week. The fraudster can keep using it. Now fraudsters are crafting those individual data sets because they know that everything's a one-shot deal. And that's because the data's so cheap and so available. We're talking here about, from an open banking point of view, what consent do I want to give? The fraudsters don't need consent. They've got all of the data, they've already stolen it all. So we can have a great argument around what we consider consent and how we want to treat our customers, and that's the right thing to do. But at the same point, the bad guys aren't playing by those rules. They've got all the data, they've got AI, they've got data sets, they've got data scientists working on this. And they're building those sets of data to attack, whether it's online, offline, point of sale, wherever. And a lot of that now is not just focused on the transaction, it's about the account. How do I get into the account? How do I get control of the account? How do I manipulate the account holder? And some of the fraud that we see in the UK now with the banks there that we're starting to work to stop is cardholders who've been contacted by the fraudster and convinced to make a payment. So of course they're going to be able to authenticate the payment. It's a genuine payment by a genuine account holder making a genuine transaction that they will authenticate with the means that they've been given. So how do you stop that? It's about having that granular view of the customer and saying, is this normal behavior for that customer? That's the key. So it's about building that granular picture because it's not just about a technology. There's no magic silver bullet here. It's about the relationship.
Yeah, very sophisticated. Did you sort of want to build on that, Leila?
Yeah. I was just really interesting comments that you were making, and I think the problem with fraud is that oftentimes the fraud departments and the traditional fraud mitigators don't necessarily think in the same way as fraudsters do, and I think AI and machine learning is helping us to combat that. And I was chatting to Ant Financial last week, and they're doing some really interesting things. And I think in many ways, the idea is to layer on protections, some of which would appear invasive to your customers, i.e. you have to fill in a one-time PIN, etc., and others which are happening in the background. And I was quite intrigued by how they're approaching some of the constraints around facial recognition, for example, which is a key component of their digital identity and authenticating customers for payments. So if you're a twin, you can, in many instances, game the system. And so they're using obviously an iris scanner, which we all know about, but they're also using an eye print, which determines the whites of your eyes. So they use the blacks of your eyes, the whites of your eyes, and a facial recognition technology, which is already 3 layers of authentication that a customer probably wouldn't even be aware of when you're looking at your phone to open your banking app or to open, in their instance, either Alipay or Tenpay app. You're not even aware of that. And so I think we're into a really exciting space where in many ways, while the fraudsters could deploy exponential and very worrying attacks, so can those people, the good guys, who are mitigating that fraud.
Very interesting.
I think there's one thing just to add, what we have to realize as an industry that whether we go into biometrics, device, all these different areas, it's all data. And, your fingerprint is just data. So there was a great thing, I don't know if you saw this about 6 months ago, I think it's the head of the Home Office or the Home Office Minister in Sweden was taking a stand at a speech or at a conference very much like this one, and somebody at the back using a camera pretty much like that took a photo of her and later got into her phone. Because the resolution of the camera was big enough while she was holding her hands up like this that you could read the fingerprints. So that's using basic off-the-shelf technology that you can buy down the road in the store, a Canon SLR or a Nikon, depending on which side you sit. I won't get into that debate, we'll never leave. So, but you can do that with that kind of technology because it's just data. And I only have 10 of these. And if you compromise all of those, I really don't want to take my shoes off to get my cash out the ATM, right? So it's one of those things where this is all just data, and the reality is it's understanding the customer and understanding the approach that they have. Biometrics are really helpful, and actually the biometric approach which I really like is, I love my thumbprint or my facial recognition on my iPhone because it's convenient. But the reality is the fallback position is still the 6-digit number because that's more secure. That's the inbuilt standard from Apple. It's your face isn't more secure than the 6-digit number is their assumption. So if Apple have built it that way, then it's just data, right? It's about convenience. Biometrics are great for making things more convenient. I want the app. I want to be able to thumbprint to go in and do my banking. That's great. But ultimately, it's about convenience. It's not necessarily about security.
Wow, yeah, it's pretty incredible, some of those emerging technologies out there that fraudsters are using to access our accounts. Well, with so much activity and focus on new technologies like AI, like blockchain, how do you identify the valuable ones, from the hype and find the right technologies for your business? It's just an open question, this one, for any of the panellists.
I think I'll kick off with that. I think the government's really interesting at the minute. So for those of you, My Health Records, if you wanted to opt out, the only way you could opt out was give them their driver's licence. So they just triangulated your data. The federal government never had your driver's licence number until that point in time. So Canberra's just now aflush with driver's licences. And then you see, on a passport front, you can go out of the country with facial recognition. Yet at a state level, we've got all these apps being developed, and we're just delivering a digital licence here. So the, and we've just lost our Minister for Digital, and what happens next year in politics, we don't know. So the government's an interesting conundrum at the minute. They're spending a lot of money on digital and improving departments and managing data, but they don't have a whole of government approach. So I think on one angle, if you want to look at not how to do it, that would be government. But if you look at what we're doing with Border Force and those controls, they're at the forefront of biometrics and recognition, and I think that's where we'll head. And I know my 12-year-old son, who used to love when I perhaps once a month I got a chance to have an afternoon snooze, he'd grab my thumb, stick it on my phone, and he'd buy something from the App Store. Now that I've moved to facial recognition on my phone, he's doing this with me to try and get me out of sleep into that thing. But kids, it's the next generation who they just see that as part of the territory. And if they can't buy something easily, that's a problem. So if I think business, I think government, and I think the generation that's upon us, it's ease, it's control, and most of it's fingerprint and face. But how we protect that and make sure it's not transportable is the sort of unknown key at the minute.
But I think you have to start with the problem, not with the technology. So I think anybody who's been to any fintech conference, and blockchain will solve every problem in the world. The blockchain is great and AI is great, but you don't start with the technology, you start with the problem. And you can often see when the technology will really lend itself. So AI in property, to me, is a natural fit. If anybody wants to work out how much a property is worth, just go to an auction and see how it changes, right? So it's the living, breathing entity. A property's value changes by every bid, every sort of a bit of emotion that someone shares. So you look at that and you go, wow, if you could simulate that, well, that's AI. And suddenly what you've got is a natural technology to solve a problem. So think the problem first and then find the right technology, not the other way around.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. Were there any questions from the floor for the panel today? Yeah, just at the back there. I think there's a roaming mic coming.
Hi, David Marshall from Defence Bank. A question that may have been potentially more appropriate for the open banking discussion, but I think it has relevance. Do you think that with the revelations around Facebook and heightened scrutiny around privacy, etc., that could in itself lead to much stronger and potentially fatal new regulations around some of these innovations that could actually potentially limit the potential of a lot of these new innovations that we're seeing in the sector or in the world?
I'll get started. Thanks for the question. So I think you've heard from the open banking session that the consent will be there for the consumer to decide. But yes, I think you're right. I mean, people will only give consent if they trust in the ecosystem. And with a lot of recent events of data leakages, the average consumer is thinking, I'll just hang fire for a minute. So we saw it in the UK. Open banking launched. It was a bit of a fizzer, if I can call it that. And those that did dive in early were still a bit apprehensive around the consent model and giving the data away. So Treasury the other day said, look, we see this as a 10-year journey. I think some people think it's a really fast one next year. It's not. And if you look at the big four banks, they're talking thin layer data sets. And the point I made on the panel is we haven't yet educated the consumer. And NPP was a sort of similar thing. You know, we sort of soft launch and get reach, but the consumer angle's there still to be done. So I think your point's well made. We're going to create the right ecosystem. It's going to have all the security and protocols, but if the consumer doesn't trust in it, it's not going to go anywhere. So I think, and then you've got the industry not really gleaning together to do that. So, and it's not on Treasury or ACCC's mind to sort of think of some great fillip for open banking to get it underway. So that is, you know, it's a challenge at the minute. I don't think anybody's staring at it.
I think there are two schools of thought here. The one school of thought is probably where my kids are at, and the millennials, where my kid had said, "Oh, I've got nothing to hide, but I don't really care about my privacy." And that is the world of a new normal, where privacy and potentially even privacy breaches are perceived culturally in a very different way to the old way of thinking, which is my privacy is everything and a major issue. And so I do think there's a generational shift. And the other school of thought is that it will take one major breach, and perhaps Cambridge Analytica was it, and perhaps there's more to come. I suspect there may be more to come, where people will no longer be willing to trade their privacy for services, and no longer barter and place a value on privacy and consent. I think one of the most difficult things is that open data and open banking is becoming a global phenomenon, and with the shift to a global environment, legal jurisdictional and regional cultural approaches to privacy are very difficult to manage. And so what is absolutely acceptable in China might be profoundly unacceptable in Australia or the UK, where we don't even have an identity card. And so the cultural and legislative jurisdictional differences between countries and between regions, I think, is the next big thing to try and address and resolve. Yeah.
I think it's going to be about transparency, though. So I think long gone now is organisations just going to take data and say, trust me, we'll do the right thing. I actually think they have to prove it. So I think there'll be some steps to be able to say there's clear audit trails. Whenever you've taken data, at any point you should be able to show exactly how that data has flowed through your system, rather than it's just in there. So I think there'll be an extra requirement for transparency, whether that's transparency for a regulator or for a consumer. I'm not quite sure, but I think you just can't now leave it as a black box and assume that that's okay.
I think, actually, I'd sort of look at the underlying architecture of this, because the reality is what's driving all of this is the fact that we don't, certainly globally, but even at a market level individually, have a good handle on what a digital identity actually is. I think that's the big problem, and I think the challenge that I often see at government level, and we've seen it in the UK, you know, trying to roll out identity cards a few years ago abortively, is the idea that we can use some kind of 19th century passport-style digital identity for citizens. Very few countries with the cultural background, as you say, you know, with the UK or Australia or most of Western Europe, aren't going to accept that kind of approach. And the reality is it's not necessary. We don't need a single identity tied to everything that we do. We all use multiple identities all the time as individuals, whether we're interacting online with different accounts to do different things. I'm sure most people in this room have more than one email address, for example. You know, many of you probably have more than one cell phone number. So, you know, we're not in a position whether it needs to be a one-size-fits-all digital identity. In fact, it's not desirable. It becomes a security risk in and of itself. So I think until we get to a point where we've actually sorted out how digital identity is going to work and how we're going to have multiple digital identities and make that run as an industry, then trying to solve for the rest of it is actually fundamentally difficult.
Thanks very much for your input there. We do have one question from Pigeonhole Live. How could we make better use of open banking data to improve our fraud management, given most customers bank with multiple financial institutions? I suppose this is just to be thrown out to the panel, whoever would like to comment.
I think that one's on me, right? Well, if you don't know already, that's exactly what Cuscal's doing with Feedzai. So I don't know if this was a setup, but I'm assuming it's not. So if you think about it, you've got an ecosystem here run by Cuscal, sitting in the middle, seeing all of that data. So you're seeing it at that level. Feedzai is processing in the back end that data and looking at the consumers, the merchants, the payment velocity, the NPP data, the card data, all of that information in one place and building a single view of what's happening across that network. So as transactions come in and out, you get the value of the bigger picture, the network view, the market view, if you like, rather than trying to implement individual controls at an organizational level one at a time. So that's really kind of how it's going to work in this ecosystem. Then if you look at what we do in Feedzai across the world, we've got systems like federated machine learning. We've got risk ledger. So that allows us to connect our customers globally and allow them to look at, data is the wrong thing to look at these days. There's so much data and it's so ephemeral. It's about what are the MOs, what are the approaches that the fraudsters are taking. So how do I know that an approach that's being used to attack a bank in the UK, I can stop that signature? I'm not going to see the same data. The fraudster's not going to employ the same data, it won't work. But they will employ the same mode of attack. So how do you create machine learning models, rules, and approaches that can stop different modes of attack that you see spring up around the world? Because these fraudsters, they can operate out of any country and operate in any country. The internet has made that remarkably democratic. So, and in fact, why would you operate in Australia if you're defrauding Australians? You risk arrest. Better to do it from Brazil. It's much safer. You're much less likely to be arrested. So that's the approach that everyone's taking. So how do we share data across our customer bases? How do we share learnings and MOs? But at the same time, within this ecosystem here, what Cuscal's done is create an ecosystem that allows everybody to benefit from what everybody else is seeing in real time without having to do extra data sharing.
We provide fraud results, and we're very concerned about the card not present fraud, and it's really exciting to see a company like Cuscal doing what they're doing, because your fraud solution is only as good as the number of fraud incidents or number of data points that you put into it. So with open banking, Cuscal will have the opportunity to become a fraud gateway for all of its clients. And so you federate out that benefit to multiple smaller customers who may find it very expensive or impractical to use that information. And the very fact that a customer is multi-banked, because it's open banking and accessible across multiple APIs, those multi-bank history points can be used and consolidated into one algorithm and designed to protect a number of smaller institutions who are connected through, for example, a Cuscal. So it's really exciting to see what's happening and very much ahead of its time in many ways.
And there is a discussion at government level at the minute with AUSTRAC, the Australian Fraud Exchange, and to a degree NPPA around just sharing blacklists and data sets. And so the Attorney General's Department's sort of given an in-principle stamp to that. So I think, with the use of AI and technology, there are blacklists sitting there that we're not sharing. And as I said before, if Richard's bad in one channel, we should make sure we recognise him in others. But and the Joint Cyber Security Centre is already also interested in that data. So I think we'll get there. It starts with some legislation, the data sharing, but fortunately the technology we can actually solve for pretty well.
Thank you.